Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Kristen Smith. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Christina Lingell. Earlier this week, Christina, you had a chance to sit on a very interesting House committee about DNA collection for those who are arrested for crimes. And when is it appropriate, in particular this case, fingerprints? When is it appropriate and why might it be appropriate sooner rather than later? So tell us what the legislation behind this is, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. The hearing itself, they said technically was just an informational hearing, but there is a bill in the Senate, Senate Bill 912, that would open the door, or rather require law enforcement agencies to take people's DNA, take samples of their DNA, which nowadays is just a cheek swab. It's nothing too invasive. But upon arrest for they were talking about it in terms of violent crimes and violent felonies. But when you actually read the language of the law in SB 912, there is violent felonies. So that includes things like assault, rape, of course, like anything like that. Criminal homicide, which has a unique place in the Pennsylvania legal code where it's not a felony. It's its own thing. So through a loophole, it hasn't been involved in certain felony rules. And also in this legislation, it mentions several different misdemeanors that they say are indicative perhaps of someone who's likely to commit violent crimes in the future. But those include things like check fraud and burglary, which certainly are criminal acts, but it's arguable whether or not those are precursors to a violent act, for sure. So in this potential legislation, anytime someone is arrested for those things, they would be swabbed and their DNA would be entered into a database. The database that currently exists is called CODIS, and it is a nationwide index of DNA that's collected by different law enforcement agencies. What it does when it gets your DNA, assuming not yours, you would never commit a crime, right? But they get your DNA and they translate it into a series of numbers. Those numbers are then linked to an identifier that's not your name or any of your personal information. And that's all it is. Of course, someone has access to be able to match the identifier with personal information like your name and address, so that, for instance, if you get arrested for breaking and entering in California and they check your DNA and find out that you committed a crime somewhere in Pennsylvania, if we're a part of this larger system. So that's the idea behind it. They say it's very secure and very private, that there's no identifying information that could compromise people by having their DNA in this system. That's really important, of course, because we know that DNA isn't just like a fingerprint where it's just, this is me. Your DNA is like, this is me, this is my mom, this is my dad, this is my brother, this is my sister. It tells a lot about a lot of things. Tells health information, all kinds of things. So, people are worried about the sensitivity of this information, but those who are advocating for it say that it's an incredibly secure program.
I think we've probably all heard about the way the DNA technology has been used to catch very violent criminals, sex offenders, serial killers, high-profile serial killers that have gone unsolved for decades. I think the one that always comes to mind for me is the Golden State Killer, who had killed and raped and assaulted a lot of people in California in the 80s. And so on the one hand, it's like this, I don't want to say miracle tool, but it's a massive help. It's a big deal for us to be able to connect crimes and to find people who shouldn't be on the street, who could harm others, right? So we all kind of agree that is a net positive for society. But then you have the other side of this is, how is your DNA being used? What can it be used for? And I think the general discomfort of giving that level of personal information to the government, no matter how much you trust them or don't trust them, it feels like a very big step in terms of where we are as far as the way that the government tracks us in general, right? So can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So opponents of this type of law, which I should say this law, some variation of this law exists in 34 different states. There are 19 who automatically do this upon arrest. So, and those are red and blue states. So it's not necessarily an obvious political issue, but it is definitely a question of privacy. And a lot of people bring up things like China or other states that we think of as being more surveillance states and the dangers of, if we open this store, then what's the next door, or what could be done? And if there was a breach, what could happen with that? The real fundamental question that actually was decided by the Supreme Court quite controversially is this against your Fourth Amendment right? So the Fourth Amendment says you cannot have unlawful search and seizures. That's why people need a warrant to search your house or to do anything that if they suspect you of a crime. They need some sort of reasonable foundation. A judge needs to say, yes, you can go search this person. If you're arrested for a crime, you haven't been convicted of anything, and they take your DNA from you, that's what some people would argue is violating that right to privacy and an illegal search and seizure. However, the Supreme Court ruled in 2013 that it did not violate the Fourth Amendment. So in terms of the law, states are allowed to do this. The ACLU spoke at this testimony very strongly against this law, and they said, they quoted Antonin Scalia, who was, of course, a beloved Supreme Court justice of the past, who said, if you're allowed to just walk into people's houses and take their stuff, you'd solve a lot of cold cases too. Like this isn't an acceptable step beyond what we currently have in terms of our rights. So it's definitely a balance, I think, between, sure, a lot of lives could be saved, cold cases could be saved, and in fact, people could be exonerated from crimes that they didn't commit, people who are wrongly imprisoned. So there's so much value that can come out of this stuff, but there is also this huge danger of, going past what we have previously as a society agreed upon as to our rights and our privacy. And so much of the unknown, especially with AI and with like the general move into a technological frontier that we're just not, we just don't know what's going to be like in the future. So it's hard to say, yeah, we should definitely just start collecting DNA from people. In fact, one representative even brought up the idea of collecting it at birth. So we just have a national database of DNA. So it's definitely a tricky question, and it's a constitutional question, even though it has, been settled by the Supreme Court. It's up to states whether or not they choose to enact those kinds of laws. And I will say, as to what you were mentioning about the kinds of crimes that it's solved and prevented, one of the speakers at the judiciary hearing was a woman, Ashley Spence, who, as a sophomore in college, had her apartment broken into. She was brutally beaten and raped for hours, and then, threatened if she ever went to the police. Years later, she received a call that her attacker had tried to break into the home of some women in California, where this is a law on the books. They ran his DNA, connected it to her crime and a bunch of others, and they found that this person was a serial rapist. So, it's really hard to look at someone who's, this person would still be free if this law hadn't been passed in California, and say like, well, you have to break a couple eggs to make an omelet or whatever.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
It's hard to say we're sacrificing the potential of saving some people in order to prioritize our social agreements and our rights and our privacies. And again, like I said, some people are freed by this. I spoke with a man, James Tillman, who had been in jail for 18 years for a rape that he didn't commit. When that person's rape kit finally got processed, he was exonerated. And then they quickly found out that it was someone else who was already in jail for something else.
Yeah. So there's so many layers to this, and we'll have to see. We'll have to see what direction Pennsylvania goes.
Yeah, I don't think it's likely to run in the House anytime soon. They've had bills like this come up in the past and the House hasn't run them. So even though it is, it was popular in the Senate, it's unlikely to move, I think, in the near future. It's also very expensive. We already have a backlog of rape kits throughout the entire country, right? So processing DNA is expensive. It would certainly add to the already tight budget situation we have in Pennsylvania.
Yes, right. Well, Christina, we'll keep an eye on this and more at thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania.